So, hi everyone. In some ways, I mean, this works very well because you've heard me talk about the tool, and now you're going to hear me talk a bit about the context in which the Voson tool was developed and how it compares to other tools. Firstly, does this horses for courses? Does this translate at all? Does anyone know what I'm talking about when I say horses for courses? No. Okay.
I have no idea, but I'm not an American, so
No. I tested this out. Pardon?
Google will translate us.
Yeah, where's Google when we need it? I tried to explain this at the University of Maryland, and I ended up getting bogged down in a discussion about equestrian matters, and which was just embarrassing. But basically, the idea is that what I'm looking at in this presentation, and there is a paper that that's sitting underneath this called the same title by Francisca Borges and myself. She's an ex-master's student from our Master of Social Research degree. Hopefully she'll be coming to do a PhD with us at some point. And anyway, the idea is that we're conducting a comparison, looking at trying to identify what are the disciplinary perspectives for hyperlink research. And given that we are able to identify disciplinary perspectives, and these are, I think, maybe contestable, these disciplinary sort of boundaries or perspectives that I'm advocating. And in fact, I'm putting people in boxes, and people don't often like to get put in boxes by other people, but that's what I'm sort of doing in this. But then given that we have some disciplinary perspectives to hyperlink network research, is it the case that some tools are better than others for answering those questions that come out of those disciplinary perspectives? So that's the background to the horses for courses. As I said, I won't talk about equestrian matters, as it just gets kind of confusing. But so this is the plan for the lecture, or the presentation. I've got too many slides, so I'm just going to be skipping through slides and hopefully leaving enough time at the end for questions. But I mean, there's lots of familiar faces here, so you were at the presentation before, so I understand that most of you are working with hyperlink data or have an interest in it. So I'm in some ways I'm preaching to the converted, which is a good thing. So first up, disciplinary perspectives. I'm going to propose that there are three main perspectives for studying hyperlink networks. And on purpose, I'm ignoring sort of what the applied physicists do and the computer scientists do. I'm ignoring that because I'm focused on perspectives that are related to sort of the humanities and social science research field disciplines. So I'm ignoring the sort of the Barabasi preferential attachment models that lead to large-scale networks that exhibit structural stylized facts such as, or they exhibit properties that have been found to be observed in large-scale networks such as power laws. I'm sort of ignoring all of that material and just focusing on what is coming out of more the social sciences and humanities. And so I'm proposing that there are three ways of thinking about hyperlink networks. We can think of hyperlink networks as citation networks, and I'll be presenting research where I believe that is the underlying conceptualization of hyperlinking. It's a hyperlink network as a citation network. We can think of hyperlink networks as social networks, and then finally we can think of hyperlink networks as issue networks. And what I'm going to be doing is talking about the differences between these three perspectives, and I'm going to be emphasizing the differences over and above the similarities. And I'm doing that on purpose because, as I said, I've set up boxes and I'm putting things in boxes. But in fact, there are quite a lot of similarities across the three approaches. So firstly, citation hyperlink networks. The body of literature that I believe advocates the conceptualization of a hyperlink network as a citation network is referred to as webometrics. This is a term that I think has it mainly has currency in the UK and in Europe, in particular in Spain. There is a there's quite a few people who identify themselves as webometricians or webmetricians. The person that I'm aware of who works in this area is Mike Thelwall from the University of Wolverhampton, and he's someone who I've had quite a bit to do with over the years. I've visited him in Wolverhampton, and we have worked on a project together. And Mike Thelwall is the author of SoSciBot, which is one of the tools that I'll be talking about. So there are three main aspects to webometrics, text content analysis, analysis of hyperlink structures, web usage analysis, and also technology, web technology analysis. I'm going to focus on just the hyperlink network, or the hyperlink structure research. Just realised I don't actually have a clock that's working, so I'll just move my... Now, Webometrics or Webometrics comes out of information science. It has its disciplinary origins in informetrics, which is a subfield of information science. And as a sort of an example of webmetrics research, I'm highlighting a paper by Barjak and Thelwall. What they did in this paper is they were looking at the factors that are correlated with websites accumulating or attracting hyperlinks. And they were focusing on websites that are owned or run by research teams in the biological sciences. So they wanted to see what characteristics are associated with a website in that particular field gaining more hyperlinks than another website. And so they used the SociBot tool to collect counts of inbound links to websites. I think it's about 400 or 500 websites, and these are all for teams in the biological sciences in Europe, I believe. And they collected attribute data for those websites about the teams, you know, the types of industries, connections they had, the types of research they were doing, the website, the team, the demographics of the team leader. They were interested to see whether men, teams that were led by men were different to teams that were led by females. In terms of the amount of hyperlinks that are being directed to those sites. So what they're doing here implicitly is they are regarding a hyperlink as a sign of sort of visibility or scientific kind of productivity or visibility or importance. And so it's like a measure of productivity, or it's seen as being a kind of a scientometric measure of visibility, I guess. And in some ways, in that way, I think you can actually regard it as a sort of an analogue to the way citation counts are used in bibliometrics. And the technique that they used was regression analysis. Well, it's actually a variant of regression analysis because they're working with count data. Okay, what about social hyperlink networks? So there's a paper in the Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication by an article by Jackson in 1997, which was really in the sort of the early days of, or the middle of the Web 1.0 era. And she talked about the potential for social network analysis to be used to analyse hyperlink network structures. She wasn't overly positive about the ability to use SNA to analyse hyperlink networks. In particular, she questioned whether some of the core underlying assumptions of social network analysis, namely the interdependence between nodes and also the sort of the emergent property of networks, whether those assumptions applied to hyperlink networks, and therefore, you know, whether or not SNA was an appropriate technique. And I thought that, so that was an interesting paper in the sense that she was saying, basically saying, you know, in some ways it makes sense to regard a hyperlink network as a social network and then use social network analysis techniques to analyse the data. But hang on, you know, is it a really valid approach given the types of behaviour that are being exhibited? Other authors have not been so careful or cautionary. They've actually just leapt in and said, okay, a hyperlink network is a social network. Let's use social network analysis. And I have to admit that's kind of been my approach as well. At least in the early days, I think in 2000, I realised that what I was doing was I was wanting to model hyperlink networks as social networks, and that's when I started to learn about social network analysis. But in more recent years, I've actually started to think more about that and whether or not, whether all hyperlink networks can be validly analysed as social networks and using social network techniques. And my belief is that it's not the case that you can analyse any hyperlink network using social network analysis. Some networks are more appropriate to regard them as social networks than other hyperlink networks. So the question I ask here is, when can we consider websites to be social actors and hyperlinks to represent social relations? And my view is it depends on the websites that you're studying. I think that with regards to, say, environmental activists, and that's a lot of the work I've done has been in that area, I think it's quite reasonable to regard the type of behaviour that they're engaging as having social elements to it. And I'm going to talk more specifically about what I mean by social elements. But I think government websites or business websites, I think it's harder to regard them or to regard them as engaging in social behaviour. In particular, government, I think the hyperlink network structures created by government are really reflecting offline institutional relationships, not social behaviour. And I believe that these differences in these types of actors and how they hyperlink, they should be revealed. The differences should be being shown in the network signatures or the structural signatures of these hyperlink networks. And I think it's important to use techniques that can that are appropriate for the types of actors that you're studying. So and so in terms of, I keep on talking about social hyperlinking. Well, the way I think of this is in the context of the exponential random graph modelling approach, which I know many of you are familiar with. I mean, yesterday when I was meeting with students, a lot of our discussions were about ERGM. So I'm sort of in, this is familiar territory. But what I wanted to just to highlight is that with exponential random graph modelling, it allows you to model two particular types of network effects or network signatures. There's the purely structural or endogenous network effects. So these are network ties that have nothing to do with the attributes of the actors who are engaging in the linking. So they are more to do with social norms, for example. And so a good example of a purely structural network effect is reciprocity. If I'm at a party and I go up to someone and hold out the hand of friendship and introduce myself to someone else, more than likely they're going to extend their hand as well and accept the hand of friendship, just simply because that's the thing to do. It's got nothing to do with my attributes or that person's attributes. It's a social norm. Another example of a purely structural network effect is transitivity. So that's the idea that a friend of my friend is my friend as well. So there's tendency for there to be transitive closure. Or an enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's another variant of transitivity. But then we've got a second classification or type of network effects, and these are actor relation effects, and these are these are network ties that result that are related to the attributes of the actors involved in the dyad. So there are three broad types. There are sender effects. So that's where the presence or absence of an attribute increases the probability that that actor sends a tie. And receiver effects are the sort of the analogue to that. So the presence or absence of the attribute increases the probability that that actor is going to receive a tie or a nomination from elsewhere in the social network. And then finally, we've got homophily effects, and that's when two actors share an attribute, then that is associated a greater chance that there is actually a tie between them. Okay, so the thing about exponential random graph models that attracted me to them, because as I've mentioned to people as I've been here the last day or two, that my background's in economics, and I had a very, fairly narrow training in economics in the sense that I never took any courses in sociology, really just fairly focused within the, I took courses in accounting and commerce, but I never ventured too far out of that territory. So when I came across exponential random graph modelling, I liked it because it reminded me of regression analysis, which is what I've done a lot of in economics. I know it's different. There are different assumptions. The unit of observation is different for one thing. But for me, the attractiveness of exponential random graph modelling is the ability to have coefficients which represent particular network effects, for example, homophily, and there'd be a standard error associated with that coefficient that allows you to determine whether or not that network effect appears to be present in a particular hyperlink network or a particular network that you're studying. I have some questions about the power of these tests, but that's not for me to. I mean, I'm and I apply these models. I'm not out there kind of developing or forging the, you know, at the frontiers of ergom. I'm just I use them. But basically, ergoms I think are attractive approaches for statistically unpacking social networks. And one of the things that I've done in my work is apply ergoms to hyperlink networks. I wasn't the first to do that. I wish I was, because I was working on it. But the first paper that I've seen that uses ergoms in the context of hyperlink networks was a paper by Shoemate and Jewett, Michelle Shoemate, and you know, so they've used the technique. But interestingly, I think what I've done with the paper with Dean Lusher that I'm referring to in this presentation is I think we looked a bit more at what are the underlying assumptions of that mean that a hyperlink network can be validly studied using exponential random graph modelling. And in fact, what we also do is we make a comparison of the exponential random graph modelling approach with a counts regression approach, and we show that at least in the context of the network that we're studying, ergom is the appropriate technique to be used. But having said all of that, I'll now get into the paper that I was just referring to. So this is a paper that Dean Lusher, he was previously at MELNet, which is the group that have put out the PNet tool. This is Pip Patterson and Gary Robbins. So they are one of the three groups that I'm aware of that are really at the forefront of developing exponential random graph modelling as a technique. So in this paper, we were interested to characterise the hyperlink network formed by websites that are advocating on behalf of refugee and asylum seekers in Australia. So this has been a very politically charged issue in recent years, especially when this research was conducted. It was the era of the Howard government, the former Conservative government, where there were certain policies about, fairly hardline policies with regards to the treatment of refugee and asylum seekers. And so that we wanted to study how these, we wanted to look at the hyperlink network of groups that were advocating in this area. And so using a snowball type approach, we collected a network of 144 websites. We classified them according to three dimensions: lobby groups, service providers, and research groups. And it wasn't a mutually exclusive classification. An organisation could have one or more of these attributes. And this is the hierarchy map for the hyperlink network of these 144 sites. We saw something like this morning. The red nodes are lobby sites. And we see that the top three nodes are lobby sites. So these are sites that have a specific role to try and exert pressure on government to change policies. So they allow people to submit online petitions, for example, to government. So this is just showing, as I mentioned this morning, it's the vertical axis. They're arranged along the vertical axis according to in degree. So these ones don't have any inbound links. These have a lot of inbound links. And this is the force-directed graph of the hyperlink network. Again, it's just showing, this time node size is proportional to in degree. And so we've got these three big nodes here that are lobby sites. We've got a cluster down here which are research sites, but that's not really of relevance to this, to the paper. So what our hypothesis was that the refugee and asylum seeker advocacy online network was, participants in that online network are purposefully directing hyperlinks to these lobby sites, since that will increase traffic to these sites and will allow political pressure to be exerted on the government of the day. So it's actually a very simple hypothesis. I mean, this paper is really a methodological paper. It's about basically looking at how we can use exponential random graph models for hyperlink networks. But we had this particular hypothesis. And so what we then did was we looked at visualizations like the ones I've just shown you, and then we also estimated an ergom model. And we had two versions of the ergom model. And you can see here, model A, that has none of the structural effects, which are up here, various structural effects, parameters that can be included. while we had only actor relation effects in this model. And model B is where it's what we regard as being the fully specified model, where we've also included in the purely structural network effects. And what we found is that model A has there are various interesting things going on here, but I wanted to focus on the receiver effects. There's a positive significant receiver effect for lobby websites. So that would support our hypothesis that the hyperlink participants in the hyperlink network are directing links to lobby sites. There's a significant evidence that that they are directing links to the lobby sites. But then in model B, once we've added in these purely structural effects, that coefficient is no longer significant. So again, it's a fairly simple story, but it's a horses for courses story. What we're saying here is that to the extent that online advocacy actors are likely to be engaging in sort of social hyperlinking behaviour, then if we estimate a model that doesn't include all of these social sort of network effects, then effectively it's a misspecified model, and it could lead to conclusions that are spurious. So that's really what we found, was that when we didn't include those network effects, we got a significant lobby receiver effect, but which disappeared when we included the structural effects. Okay, so that's what I've just summarised. Let's move on to issue networks. Now, I have to admit that this is something I know I don't know a huge amount about. This is the work of Richard Rogers from the University of the Netherlands, and it's the issue crawler software is what's the software that's related to issue networks. Issue networks, I've just got a few statements up there that have come out of various pieces of work that Richard Rogers has done. But he uses terms like associational spaces, which are defined by hyperlinks. And he says that we can distinguish issue networks from popular understandings of networks in the following way. Nodes may not be on the same side of an issue. Nodes may be organisations, individuals, news stories, leaks. Actors may be antagonistic, adversarial, and estranged. So already, I think that what I get from it is that issue networks are something very different to social hyperlink networks, such as the one that I studied with Dean Lusher. And I think they are quite different from citation hyperlink networks as well. Dean Lusher and we purposefully didn't include any government websites into our hyperlink network, even though these advocacy actors were hyperlinking to government websites. We excluded them. And one of the reasons we did that was because if we included the government sites in there, when we wouldn't, it would have been harder for us to interpret what the hyperlink meant. In particular, we're quite confident that in our network, the hyperlinking that's going on is associated or representative of a positive affect relation between the two sites. While if we had government sites in there, particularly our immigration department, a hyperlink to the immigration department from an advocacy site would probably have sort of a negative affect associated with it. So having introduced these three disciplinary perspectives to studying hyperlink networks, I now want to talk a bit about identifying a hyperlink network. And this is, again, I'm drawing here from the paper with Dean Lusher. So there's a paper by Laumann et al. That we quote in our paper where they talk about the definition of a social network involving three fundamental and interrelated issues. Firstly, or questions really. The first question is, what constitutes a social tie? Secondly, who are the nodes or actors? And thirdly, where is the network boundary? And these three questions, I think, are very useful for helping us to further elucidate the differences between citation hyperlink networks, social hyperlink networks, and issue networks. Firstly, who are the nodes? Well, in a citation hyperlink network and a social hyperlink network, the nodes are typically going to be represent websites or represent organisations or groups. Okay, and some of these may have an offline presence, or they may not have an offline presence. With an issue network, the nodes can represent a much greater number of actors or type of actors. They can represent news items or documents. And as I said before, they can also represent actors who are on opposing sides of the issue. What constitutes a tie? Well, this gets back to what I was talking about before. In the context of digital analysis of digital trade data, that's what I do. I don't go and interview the website owners and ask them why did they link, to the other website. And I'm not saying that that's not valid research to be done, undertaking. It's just not what I do. So when you're not actually going and talking to the actors and finding out why they hyperlinked, you're dealing with it's a case of unobtrusive research, and it leads to issues of how do you interpret a hyperlink. And so what I contend is that hyperlinks in citation and social hyperlink networks are typically going to indicate positive rather than negative affect relations, and they're also they're going to represent the transfer of practical and symbolic resources that the recipient is going to want to receive. Okay, in the case of the Barjak and Thelwall paper, as I mentioned, hyperlinks to academic websites are basically being conceived as being something akin to an indicator of scientific visibility or prominence or authority. In a paper that I have with Matthew O'Neill in Social Networks, we looked at hyperlinks between environmental activist websites, and we argue that hyperlinks in that context convey practical resources in terms of what we call index authority. So that's, it leads to a website being more prominent because they're more highly ranked on a web index or a search index. And also symbolic resources, or what we call boundaries of belonging, which help to establish online collective identity. In citation and social hyperlink networks, I believe that actors are less likely to link to dismiss. What they're more likely to do is just to simply ignore an actor that they don't agree with. Okay, and then in terms of the network effects that I mentioned before, citation hyperlink network, and I expect that a citation hyperlink network is going to mainly exhibit only actor relation effects. And I'd be interested to get people's reaction on this because I know that there's work going on in Sonic where the citation networks are being studied using exponential random graph modelling. And I'd like to know whether, in fact, you are finding significant social sort of, purely structural network effects in those networks. A social hyperlink network, I would contend that it's going to exhibit both actor relation and also purely structural network effects, and that's what we found with the research that I did with Dean Lusher. With an issue network, we can expect that there will be negative affect relations, because if you're studying, for example, climate change, you can have in the same issue network, you can have environmental activists, and you can have big business, and you can have government, and you can, so you've got everyone in there. Anyone who's kind of engaged with the issue is in that issue network. So you might have, environmental activists linking to big business as a, and there's negative affect associated with that link. The thing about issue networks is that they can contain objects such as news items, documents. The nodes don't have to be organisations or groups or to have that sort of real-world connection necessarily. So from that point of view, I think it's hard to think about issue networks as containing network effects as we know them in the context of exponential random graph modelling. The other thing that's, the third question that Laumann raised and others raised is the issue of network boundaries. Now, with citation and social hyperlink networks, it may be possible in advance to specify a population of websites that you're interested in. So, for example, you might be interested in studying environmental activist organisations who have some official status in the sense that they're officially registered as non-profit organisations in the US for tax purposes, and so there might be some sort of listing of them because of that particular status that they have, and that could then be your population, and then you could conduct a random sample of those sites, and I've seen work like this, and then construct the hyperlink network of that random sample. With an issue network and with other types of social and citation hyperlink networks, like for example, where there isn't an obvious population out that you can identify, it might be necessary to conduct snowball sampling approaches. And typically that's what I've done with my work on environmental activist sites. We've environmental activist organisations. We've started off with a set of sites that we know about. We find out who they link to, and then we find new sites that we then promote to be seed sites. And then finally, network type is also useful as a way of distinguishing amongst these three disciplinary perspectives to hyperlink network research. So there's some background there on types of networks, and I know I'm preaching to the converted here. Everyone, this group knows about ego networks, complete networks, and also partial networks. So how is this useful in terms of us distinguishing between these disciplinary approaches? Well, let's think about the case of studying climate change using hyperlink data. If I was studying climate change using hyperlink data and I was wanting to do it using a citation hyperlink network approach, the way I might go about it is I might identify a set of environmental sites that are engaged in the issue of climate change, and then I would use software to find the total number of inbound links to each of those sites. Okay, and then I might do a regression to see what characteristics seem to be associated or correlated with a site receiving more or less inbound links. The thing about this citation hyperlink network is I wouldn't have any information about how those websites necessarily connect to each other, because it's just raw counts of inbound links that I would have. I'd have no information on the connections between the sites that are linking to these environmental activist sites, again, because it's raw counts of data of inbound links. So what you're doing in this case is you're effectively reducing the link structure to the link structure of the network in which these websites sit. The link structure is being reduced to an attribute of each of these sites, which is the count of the total number of sites that link to them. It becomes an attribute of each of those websites, and then that's used as a dependent variable, for example, in a regression. In contrast to that, a social hyperlink network approach would involve constructing the complete network for all of those organisations who are engaged in climate change. So you would find out how they link to one another. And then finally, an issue network would also be a complete network, but it would include nodes other than the environmental activist websites. It would also maybe include big business sites that who are engaged in climate change action. It would include government sites as well. So I think this is it's a fairly amateurishly drawn diagram, but I think it in some ways it emphasises what I think is the main difference between the Webometrics approach to studying hyperlinks and the social hyperlink network approach. So what you're doing is you're just finding that the inbound links to each site, but you don't really know anything about them because you're typically using like the Yahoo API or the Bing API to find just an estimate of the total number of sites that link to that site, and you don't know. Consequently, you don't know how they link to one another. So it's just a series of ego networks, and that's really the citation hyperlink network approach, at least as evidenced or as conducted in a lot of the Webometrics research. By the way, it might be coming across that I'm being critical of these various approaches, but again, I'm just saying it's horses for courses. So it depends on what phenomena you're studying and what the outcomes are. Okay. So are there horses for courses? Well, firstly, I have to introduce the horses. So there are three packaged software tools that I'm focusing on here. Voson, that we spent this morning investigating. You'll notice that I got rid of this very ugly panning kind of tool. It used to work, actually. You'd click on a green arrow and the whole thing would shift one way, but it's not very nice. So that's a slightly older version of the software. That's Voson plus NodeXL. So the Voson data collection routines are available through the NodeXL software, which is a plug-in to Excel 2007, 2010. By the way, I see there are some people here who weren't at the session this morning, so I shouldn't assume too much. But these are software that I've developed at the ANU as part of my research, and I've had some contributors. In particular, I'll show you the contributors later on. Then we've got SoSciBot. So this is the software that comes out of the University of Wolverhampton. Mike Thelwall's behind this. And then finally, this is what Issue Crawler looks like. These are the horses. There's some very obvious differences between the three of them already. Number one, Issue Crawler and SoSciBot have been around for longer than Voson, and I have to say, I hate to have to admit it, but they are more popular than Voson. There's a lot of work that's been done using both of them, and I was aware of Issue Crawler when I created Voson, and in fact I was quite inspired by it. In particular, I was inspired by the fact it's hosted software. You access it through a web browser, and I thought that was very important to have that feature, and that's the way I built Voson. So what we do, Francisca and I, what we do in this paper is we attempt to run the three horses over three different courses. Namely, we use them to construct citation, social, and issue hyperlink networks, or to do those three disciplinary variants of hyperlink network research using each of those three tools. And the question is one tool better or worse for each of these types of analysis? I should at this point mention that as a disclaimer really that I'm heavily associated with the Voson software, obviously. I'm also commercializing the Voson software, so I don't want this to be seen as some sort of marketing kind of pitch for Voson. It's this type of comparative work that I've done, and I did it in the paper with Dean Lusher as well. It's really come about because people always ask me, why would I use Voson rather than Issue Crawler? What's the difference between Voson and Issue Crawler? And often I can't tell them what the difference is because I haven't used Issue Crawler myself, and I don't really know a lot about issue networks or the disciplinary foundations or origins of issue networks. And so this has come about because it's something that people ask me, and people also ask me, why did you create Voson when SoSciBot was around or Issue Crawler was around? And I did it because I was wanting to do type analysis that I didn't think those two tools could support. And so I think what I'm doing here is trying to just further establish exactly what it is that I do and why I think it's different to what other approaches to hyperlink network research are. Okay, so what we did is we constructed hyperlink networks using the same 40 seed URLs. And this is a sample of sites that come out of the paper that I did with Matthew O'Neill. And it's very preliminary work at this stage. The paper is available. I emailed it to Marilyn and other supporters. But it's that's kind of hot off the press, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I'd be very keen to get any feedback that you might have. But our preliminary conclusions is that it's quite difficult to compare the three packages because they each have their way of doing things, and there's different ways of setting up crawls, and it's quite hard to come up with a set of parameters that seems to make them to make a good comparison. So we're still working on that actually. But I think that what the conclusion that's emerging at this stage is that in the same way that in the previous part of my talk, I kept on emphasizing the differences between citation networks, citation hyperlink networks, social hyperlink networks, and issue networks. I think I was finding that there were more similarities between citation hyperlink networks and social hyperlink networks than issue networks. Issue networks were a bit out on the side compared to those other two. And in the same way, we found with our initial work that quite easy networks that we constructed using Voson and SoSciBot looked more or less similar. Okay, they were quite similar. While the network constructed using Issue Crawler was very different. And the reason for that is because there are different types of actors in there, but also Issue Crawler has this automatic snowballing approach that it has. And so some of the seed sites, some of these 40 seed sites were not even in the final network that Issue Crawler delivered. And that's because it has this co-link approach so I think that there were some seed sites that were dropped from that network because they weren't being linked to by two or more other seed sites. And so that was immediately made it quite difficult to make the comparison between the two. But what we're going to do with this work is we've really just focused on using the software to do social hyperlink network research, but we're going to then go back to doing citation network research and also issue network research. And I suspect that we're going to find that if you want to do issue network research, really issue crawl is the software that you use, that Voson wouldn't, and SoSoBot are probably not appropriate for that type of research. So I think there will be horses for courses. Okay. Voson, and I want to talk just very briefly a bit about the Voson project and software. The Voson project formally commenced in 2005 with a grant that I received at that time, or me and colleagues received. But the research dates back to 2002. That's when I started getting interested in hyperlink network research and started building a crawler. So we've had 3 or 4 grants that have helped us sustain the work. There were lean years between 2005 and 2009. That was where, it was really just Rob Ackland in his office huddled over the computer, keeping the thing going. But now I'm in the boom time at the moment because we've got another grant. We've got 2 grants here back to back, and that's providing some resources for a software developer to do some work with me, which is great. So these are some sort of key moments or key events along the time, the Voson sort of in the Voson history. 2004 to 2005, there was a desktop version of Voson. It was software that would run only in Linux, and it had really beautiful graphics because I could use OpenGL graphics, and and I actually had this amazing visualization that I can show you just very briefly. This is going to be worth it, isn't it? So this over here is software called HypeViewer, and it's hyperbolic space visualization tool. I don't understand the mathematics of hyperbolic space, but I knew how to get the software to compile, and I incorporated it into Voson. It's software that comes out of Stanford University. There's Tamara Munzner, who's now, at least when I last checked up on her, she's at Google, but she helped me. I couldn't get the software to compile, and she actually gave me some assistance, which I really appreciated. So for a while, Voson actually incorporated this software in as its visualization engine, and you can't. I mean, I don't know if people have seen this, but it's you click on a node and everything kind of shifts into focus. It's kind of like Escher doing network research, and it was really beautiful. But yeah, once I went to using Voson, the web application, I had to lose the OpenGL visualization. So in 2006, we released the web app version, and that's what people were using this morning. And it's been available for use by academics and students since 2006. And I call that Voson at ANU because for a long time, I only allowed academics and students to use Voson. So I'd be getting requests, the occasional request from people who, either didn't see what I'd written on the web page, that it was not available to anyone apart from an academic or student, or they saw that and they'd still, see if I could use it. And I'd just say, look, I'm sorry, I can't let you use it unless you show me your credentials. And some people were clearly consultants who had had some university affiliation and therefore a university email account. And for me, that was good enough. And so they'd get used to access to it. But for a lot of other people, they just that turned them off it. And I did that because I was running it on ANU servers and I couldn't justify allowing other people to use it. In early 2008, the Voson web crawler became available for use. So the software was available in 2006, but it wasn't actually in early 2008 that I allowed people to actually do their own crawls. So it was kind of useless up until early 2008 for most people's purposes. And it's not like I was holding back all of this stuff, to be spiteful. It's just, software development incredibly time intensive, and I didn't want to release a web crawler that was just going to die, and I had to kind of release it in a way that I could keep control over what was going on in terms of the use of the ANU servers. And then early 2010, Voson plus NodeXL was released. That's been quite a important sort of milestone in the development of Voson. It's been interesting for me because I turned my back on Microsoft back in 1998. It's kind of interesting that I'm now associated with Microsoft through Node Excel. Of course, it's promoted as being open source software, but I don't actually I don't agree with the use of that term. But, you know, the bottom line is that in my opinion, Microsoft have done, with Node Excel, they've done, well, you know, and when I say Microsoft, I mean Mark Smith, okay, and his colleagues have done what I always hoped to be able to, basically I wanted to get Voson hooked up to an international audience. You know, the web application is great, but the ability to get people to use it has been immensely improved by hooking up with Node Excel. And the thing about Node Excel that I find really interesting is that it's aimed at social media network research, so that's great. But number two, they were very keen to get these third-party plugins, such as Voson, involved. And so Voson was the first third-party plugin for Node Excel, and it's worked very well for me, and it's worked well for Node Excel, I think, as well, and you know, and Mark Smith. And then mid-2010, Voson was available for use by non-academics. So that's when my company, Uberlink, started. We started maintaining a server off campus, and we would allow anyone to use it, anyone who could provide some reasonable kind of demonstration that they were not a spammer. Okay, and then in 2011, we're hoping that all Voson software services are going to be run by Uberlink. I'm basically shifting it out of the ANU for just general purpose use of the software, and the reason I'm doing that is because there's just not the resources to keep it going at the ANU. There's, it's not really, so I think it's going to have more impact, and we're going to make the software better if we're doing it within a company. Having said that, we're not going to lose our connections to academic research. I mean, I'm remaining an academic, and the software is going to be used. You know, we want students and academics to continue to use it. And this is the people who are associated with the project currently. There's, I should have a list of other people who've contributed at various points, but this is that's available on the website if you're interested. So in at the ANU, we've got Derek Chen, who's a full-time developer working with me at the moment, and two research assistants who are working part-time. And then in the company, Derek's also involved, and another developer, Roy. And then we've got Jamshid Shorish, who I met through Nosh, actually. Nosh put us in touch, and he's another economist who I've done research with, and he's involved in the company as the CTO. And then finally, I just wanted to show you the timeline of new accounts. So this is quite interesting, I think. It shows the number of accounts that have been issued. So this is actually October here, and after this morning's activity, it'll jump up quite a lot, which is good. But it's showing every month how many new accounts I signed up, and this blip over here was because I actually set up a new database system at this point, and so I just created all the accounts that were in existence at then. And so I think there's been quite, 665 accounts have been issued to date, and that's not without really a lot of marketing or anything like that. But the bottom line is that this is a niche product. It's not going to be tens of thousands of users. It's a niche product, but there is steady and growing demand. And then these people might be wondering about these two blips. So my background's in economics, so I had to crunch the numbers, put the numbers through to find out what was causing this increase in new accounts. And this is the regression analysis came up with this, the Nosh effect. So this is these are the two courses that Nosh teaches in social network analysis here, and this was a very interesting week for me when I had all of these students. And I have to hand it to Brian Keegan, who was the TA, I think, both years. And because I was delighted when Nosh told me that he was keen to use Voson plus Node Excel for the course, but I did say, please don't kill please make sure the students don't kill my server. And they were all very, very good in terms of setting the crawlers, not too many seed sites, and basically following whatever instructions Brian and Nosh came up with. And so, I'm home, and there's this interesting seasonal effect. So this is the start of the academic year in the Northern Hemisphere, and we always have an increase in numbers at that point. But I think that's it. So thank you, and any questions?
very intrigued to see that you mentioned that when you on the slide with where you did the actual network analysis and when the structural network kind of like diminished the lobby effect.
Yeah, yeah.
What happened as it appeared from the slide was that it not only diminished the sender effect or the receiver effect, but you got to see another effect.
Oh, that wasn't there previously. Yeah, I think you're right. There was a
Yeah, there was a slide. So the lobby effect on the receiver effect is gone away.
Yeah.
But instead, you get a sender effect from the lobby, which is like total opposite effect.
Oh yes, up there. Yeah, yeah, that's right. They seem to be positively associated with sending ties.
So what's the explanation for that?
I have none. Yeah.
I think it's probably related to the reciprocity structure patterns. The reciprocity part. Because it's captured both sender and receiver. So controlling the same part for the rest of them.
Oh, okay. Then that means that.
So in this case, the interpretation is pure sender effect and pure receiver effect. Yeah. Previously, there's overlapping.
Oh, okay. Because now we're actually controlling for reciprocity specifically. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yep.
Were you considering, or are you considering re-implementing your OpenGL visualizer with like WebGL now that you have a web tool?
I'd love to. I was wondering. I figured that things must have travelled a long distance since mid 2005 or whenever when I created it. So at that time, I had seen a teapot being rendered through the web, and I think I actually even managed to get a teapot being rendered through the web. But it seemed that it was not going to be feasible for me to do it myself. But the thing that I'd heard of WebGL, but I haven't really investigated it. But I've also heard of HTML5 as being the standard that a lot of people are going to. So my visualizations are using SVG, scalable vector graphics, and so yeah. So
do it in JavaScript.
Beg your pardon?
You should do it in JavaScript.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, yeah. Would that be? Is that WebGL? Is it? Or
you can use WebGL.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I would like to do something to get the to improve the visualizations. It's a bit clunky at the moment, but yeah. So I would be keen to explore something like that.
Is that Linux version still available somewhere for the Linux geeks among us? Or is it totally dead?
Oh yeah, no, it's totally dead. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's available in source code somewhere buried. But yeah, yeah.
And you should recompile it yourself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yep.
So I have a more sort of theoretical question about issue networks. Like you talked about the problem of how to identify a node, but now, for example, if I think of even using Twitter as one of the nodes, and not only a particular user account, but potentially every single tweet of that user could be coded differently and could behave as an independent node. So how does one use crawlers to capture?
I'm doing stuff with Twitter, but it's using. So I'm using Python, like Tweepy, which is a Python client for connecting to the Twitter API, and it's yeah, Twitter's yeah. So I've got no intention. I've got no intention to get Boson doing anything with Twitter data at this stage, just simply because it's. I feel like I have to kind of focus on things that I can, like a niche that I can actually do reasonably well, and I've avoided. I mean, it does blogs pretty well. It does sort of Web 1.0 hyperlink networks. I think it does that. I mean, that's what it's specialized. What it's that's the core kind of competency, I guess, of Boson. But yeah, Twitter. Yeah, I think Twitter. It's easy to collect Twitter network data, and I'm doing that using Tweepy. But in terms of actually merging it, with hyperlink data, I don't know how to do it. Yeah, I don't know how to do it successfully. I mean, Twitter does get picked up in my crawls, but that's because people link to their Twitter profile from their website, for example. But it's not picking up particular tweets or anything like that. Yeah, I don't know about issue crawler. Maybe that does a better job of that. Any other questions?
I do. I'm trying to think of how to phrase it though. So these three different ways that we can kind of conceptualize hyperlink networks, like as citation networks, as social networks, or as issue networks. So we're kind of scholars interested in this field, so we can the way that you conceptualize the network will influence the way we analyze it, or and we're endowed with levels of expertise that, like, say, the average person who's surfing the web does not, they don't have that same insight. So I'm wondering, like, the average person using these spaces to capture information or whatnot, like, is not going to understand these three different ways to conceptualize. I mean, like, but they are essentially three different things. They're not just like three different names for the same thing.
I mean, that's what I'm proposing. I have to admit it's what I believe that they are three very different things, but it's in some ways it's a gut feeling that I've got, right? And I'm trying to kind of amass some sort of evidence to show that it is a meaningful distinction that I'm making.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry to cut off you.
So on a substantive level, like how can we, I mean, maybe it's just an issue of kind of like media, digital literacy, but like, my concern is that the average web server, not kind of knowing that these things are actually three different things, might confuse a kind of a social hyperlink network with an issue network. And if they are substantively two different things, then what they take from their experience navigating those spaces may be, I'm probably not phrasing the question properly.
Yeah, I guess I'm aiming this at the average hyperlink researcher than the average, not the user, and it's just to say that, well, maybe what you're, and it came about because when I spent 6 months at the Oxford Internet Institute, and people were wanting to put me in a box. They were trying to figure out who's this Rob Ackland guy? What does he do? And then they said, oh, you're a Webometrics guy. They were seeing me as someone similar to Mike Thelwall, which I've got no problem with being associated with Mike Thelwall because I'm very impressed with the work he does. But I just thought that a lot of his work is about studying scholarly hyperlinking behaviour, and I was not doing scholarly hyperlinking behaviour, and so I thought what I do is different. But why is it different? And why is it different to what Richard Rogers does? Because I just have this gut feeling that it is different. I'm not saying it's better than what I do by any means. I'm just saying it's different. So yeah, and so I'm trying to specify why I think it's different. And I do have this issue about that counts regression, which a lot of people do, and I've done that with a paper with Rachel Gibson, a political party networking paper, and I mean, my question is why is it that people like Mike Thelwall and Richard Rogers don't use exponential random graph modelling? Well, in fact, I do, and that's the technique that I've really kind of attached myself onto. Why is it that they don't do it? Is it just because they don't know about it, or is it because they believe the phenomena that they're interested in studying is not going to be well captured by an ergon model? And I don't see that anyone else has talked about this, so I'm kind of it's part of the contribution that I think I'm trying to make, is just to say, well, this is I'm not going to use the phrase again. Yeah, the horse's phrase. Yeah, sorry. So I'm happy to chat with people afterwards if there's any further questions. But I know it's we've run out of time anyway. So thanks everyone for your attention.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.